Imagine this, a bustling classroom suddenly falls silent. Eyes widen in disbelief as a teacher, in a moment that no one saw coming, pours paint over the head of a young black girl. The bright color drips down, staining her hair and clothes. Gasps fill the air. Hearts race. But what happens next? Trust me, you won't believe the shocking twist that follows. Before we dive deeper into this intense story, we want to take a moment to acknowledge you, our incredible viewers. Please drop a comment below with your name and where you're watching from. You're not just a viewer to us, you're part of our community, and we appreciate you so much. Your support is what makes our channel grow, and we can't thank you enough. Remember, your comments and engagement are what keep our channel alive. You truly mean the world to us, and we are so grateful to have you here. Thank you for being a part of our journey. Monica stood at the front entrance of her new school, clutching her backpack straps with both hands. The building loomed over her, an imposing brick structure that felt cold despite the warmth of the early morning sun. Her heart raced as she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Today was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to prove herself in a place where no one knew her yet. But an uneasy feeling twisted in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't shake no matter how much she tried. Stepping inside, she was immediately surrounded by the noise of bustling students, lockers slamming shut, and friends reuniting after the long summer break. Monica walked carefully, her eyes scanning the hallways lined with students who laughed, whispered, and threw curious glances her way. Her skin prickled with self-consciousness, but she kept her head high. She couldn't show any sign of weakness. Not on her first day. A few students stared longer than necessary, their eyes narrowing slightly. Monica tried to ignore it, repeating to herself that she was strong, that she had faced worse. Yet, the whispers seemed to follow her down the hall, echoing in her mind. She found her assigned locker and fumbled with the combination, her hands trembling ever so slightly. A group of girls nearby laughed at something one of them said, and Monica felt the laughter cut through her like a knife, even though she knew it probably wasn't directed at her. "Hey, are you lost?" a voice suddenly asked, startling her. She turned to see a tall boy with a confident smirk on his face. His question didn't seem friendly, it dripped with an almost mocking curiosity. "No," Monica replied, forcing her voice to remain calm and steady. She met his gaze, refusing to look away first. The boy gave her a long, evaluating look before walking away, leaving her with a lingering sense of unease. Monica took another deep breath and opened her locker. She had made it this far. No matter what happened, she would push through the day. But as the morning bell rang, signaling the start of classes, she couldn't help but wonder just how difficult this new beginning would turn out to be. Little did she know, her first day would set in motion a series of events that would test her resilience in ways she could never have imagined. As Monica navigated the maze-like hallways of her new school, she couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched. Every step she took seemed to draw more eyes, and the whispering grew louder, more pronounced. She walked past groups of students gathered near lockers, their conversations pausing as she passed by. A few students made no effort to hide their scrutiny, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. In her first class, Monica chose a seat near the middle, hoping to blend in. As she settled into her chair, she noticed the sideways glances from her classmates. A girl with blonde hair and bright blue eyes whispered something to the boy next to her, and they both turned to look at Monica. Their eyes lingered for a moment, and then they exchanged smirks. Monica tried to focus on her notebook, pretending she didn't notice the attention, but her cheeks flushed with heat. She felt out of place, like an outsider who had intruded on a space where she didn't belong. The teacher, a tall woman with glasses named Mrs. Collins, called the class to order. Monica hoped the lesson would distract her classmates and give her some reprieve from their stares. But even Mrs. Collins seemed to hesitate for a split second when she noticed Monica. The teacher's smile wavered, just for a moment, before she quickly composed herself and began the roll call. Monica listened as names were read aloud, waiting for her turn. When Mrs. Collins finally reached her name, her voice carried a hint of unfamiliarity, as though she were trying to figure Monica out. "Monica Williams?" Mrs. Collins called, her eyes flicking up to meet Monica's. "Here," Monica responded, her voice even but soft. The teacher nodded, moving on, But Monica didn't miss the slight furrow in her brow, as if she were mentally cataloging Monica as someone different, someone who didn't quite fit. As the lesson continued, Monica tried to focus on the words written on the board, but her mind kept wandering. She could feel eyes on her, a constant pressure that made her skin crawl. A boy behind her tapped his pen against his desk, a steady, irritating rhythm. When she glanced over her shoulder, he looked directly at her and smirked, raising an eyebrow in a silent challenge. The feeling of being unwelcome was suffocating, pressing down on her from all sides. Monica clenched her jaw and gripped her pen tightly. This wasn't just nerves or first-day jitters, it was something more insidious. The air was thick with an unspoken message, "You don't belong here." And even though no one said the words out loud, Monica could feel them echoing around her, tightening like a noose. By the time the bell rang, she was exhausted, not from the classwork, but from the relentless scrutiny. Gathering her things, she took another deep breath, trying to shake off the anxiety. She knew she couldn't let them see how much it affected her. She had to keep her head high, no matter how hard it was. But deep down, she wondered how long she could hold on before the weight of all those suspicious, judgmental eyes broke through her defenses. Monica's anxiety only grew as she entered her next class, history. The room was lined with large windows that let in streams of sunlight, but the atmosphere felt anything but warm. At the front of the classroom stood a man whose presence dominated the entire space. Mr. Baker. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, he seemed to command respect and fear in equal measure. Mr. Baker wore a perfectly pressed shirt and a tie, his appearance immaculate. He scanned the room with an expression of quiet authority, his gaze resting on each student for a moment before moving on. When his eyes landed on Monica, they lingered a fraction longer. The way he looked at her wasn't curiosity, it was more like assessment, as though he were sizing her up, already passing silent judgment. "Take your seats," he ordered, his voice deep and clipped. The room fell silent as the students obeyed, the sound of scraping chairs echoing in the stillness. Monica found a spot near the side of the room, and as she sat down, she felt the intensity of Mr. Baker's eyes on her back. She forced herself not to squirm, trying to appear calm and composed. The lesson began, and Monica did her best to focus on the words Mr. Baker spoke. He lectured about ancient civilizations with a kind of detached passion, his voice commanding and authoritative. But there was something unsettling about him, something that made Monica's skin crawl. His movements were precise, his words cutting and crisp. He spoke to the class as if he were addressing a group of soldiers rather than teenagers, his tone brooking no argument or discussion. Every time Monica dared to raise her eyes, she caught him looking in her direction. Once, he paused in the middle of a sentence, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he regarded her. It was just a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Monica wondered if she was imagining it, if her nerves were making her paranoid. But then he made his way over to her row, walking deliberately, his footsteps heavy on the tiled floor. Stopping beside her desk, he looked down at her with an unreadable expression. The room seemed to hold its breath, students watching intently to see what would happen. Monica's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Miss Williams," he said slowly, as if tasting each syllable of her name. "Are you paying attention?" "Yes, Mr. Baker," Monica replied, her voice steady even though her heart pounded in her chest. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Good," he said, but there was a hint of something in his tone, a subtle note that made her feel as though she had failed some unspoken test. With a final, cold stare, he turned away and continued his lecture, leaving Monica feeling exposed and vulnerable. It became clear to her, even on that first day, that Mr. Baker was different. He wasn't just strict or demanding. There was something about him that felt dangerous, something that made Monica believe he could, and would, do whatever he wanted to those he deemed unworthy. And as she sat there, trying to blend into the background, she couldn't help but fear that she had already been marked as a target. The days that followed were an exercise in endurance for Monica, and Mr. Baker wasted no time making her feel unwelcome. His sharp, authoritative presence loomed over every lesson, and his tone carried a subtle but unmistakable edge whenever he addressed her. What unsettled Monica the most, however, were the veiled comments he would make, thinly disguised as innocent observations or jokes. Class, Mr. Baker announced one afternoon, pacing back and forth in front of the whiteboard, it's crucial to understand that history is full of people who either rose to greatness or fell into obscurity. Those who worked hard and conformed to society's standards found success. Others, he paused, his gaze settling on Monica with a pointed intensity, found themselves forgotten, left behind because they couldn't or wouldn't adapt. A few students in the room snickered, but Monica kept her face neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew exactly what he was doing, though. Each word felt like a barb, an underhanded way of singling her out without openly admitting it. The subtlety of his attacks made them even more powerful, and she could feel the tension tightening in her chest. Another day, during a discussion about explorers and their impact on indigenous populations, Mr. Baker's commentary grew even more insidious. You see, he said, with a small, cold smile, the world was once divided. Some people were destined to lead, to create civilization, while others, well, let's just say they needed a guiding hand. It's a pattern that we still see echoes of today, isn't it? This time, a few students glanced at Monica, their eyes wide with discomfort, but no one said a word. Monica's hands curled into fists under her desk. She felt the weight of every unspoken accusation, every insinuation that Mr. Baker was making. It was as if he were testing her limits, pushing to see just how much she could take. Then there were the jokes, thinly veiled in a way that made it impossible to call him out without sounding overly sensitive. Careful now, he would say whenever Monica answered a question correctly, his voice laced with mock surprise. Looks like Miss Williams might actually be capable of keeping up. The class would laugh awkwardly, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. Each time, Monica felt a burn of humiliation creep up her neck, but she forced herself to stay calm. The worst part was the way Mr. Baker seemed to relish in her discomfort. His eyes would flicker with satisfaction whenever she struggled to hide her emotions, as though he were feeding off the power he had over her. Yet he never crossed a line so blatantly that he could be reported. Every comment was carefully crafted, every insult wrapped in just enough ambiguity to protect him from consequences. Monica began to dread history class, knowing she was walking into a minefield of subtle, relentless attacks. But no matter how much it hurt, she reminded herself that she couldn't let him break her spirit. If she reacted, if she showed weakness, it would only give him what he wanted. And as the days dragged on, she clung to the hope that somehow, some way, she would find a way to fight back. Despite the constant barrage of veiled insults and the suffocating sense of isolation, Monica refused to let herself be defeated. Every morning, she stood in front of the mirror, taking deep breaths, repeating silent mantras, * stay strong. Don't let them win. You are more than this, *. But it wasn't easy. Each day in school felt like stepping onto a battlefield where she had to be constantly on guard. The comments from Mr. Baker never stopped, and the stares from her classmates made her feel like she was under a microscope. Yet Monica was determined to find ways to push back, even if she had to do it quietly. In class, she began to speak up more often. Her voice wavered at first, but she forced herself to participate in discussions. If Mr. Baker asked a question, she raised her hand, answering with as much confidence as she could muster. Sometimes, her heart raced with anxiety, but she refused to let her fears show. She knew that silence would only make her seem more vulnerable, and she wanted to prove that she wouldn't be silenced. Once, during a lesson about civil rights, Monica took a leap of courage. Mr. Baker made an offhand remark about how society had evolved but still had troublesome elements that resist change. His eyes flicked briefly toward Monica, and she felt the anger flare in her chest. Actually, she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, the civil rights movement showed that real progress is made when people refuse to accept the status quo, even when it's dangerous or unpopular. Change comes from those who are brave enough to stand up against what's wrong. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Monica could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Mr. Baker's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. She could see the annoyance simmering just beneath the surface, but he forced a thin, tight smile. Well said, Miss Williams, he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. But sometimes, bravery can be mistaken for rebellion, don't you think? Monica met his gaze and held it, refusing to back down. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some of them wide with shock, others with a flicker of admiration. For the first time, she sensed that maybe, just maybe, she had made an impact. Outside of class, Monica tried to find allies, even if it felt like a long and lonely journey. She approached a few classmates during lunch, hoping to start conversations, to make connections. Most of them seemed hesitant, nervous about associating with her, but one girl named Emily offered a small smile and sat with her for a while. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Monica also threw herself into her artwork, using it as an outlet for her pain and frustration. She sketched images of strength, of resilience, of people who had faced adversity and come out stronger. Her art became her sanctuary, a place where she could express everything she couldn't put into words. Still, the weight of Mr. Baker's hostility and the constant tension wore her down. There were days when she felt exhausted, when she wanted to give up, to run away from it all. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let herself be broken. She had a fire inside her, and even if it flickered and wavered, she refused to let it go out. Monica was determined to keep fighting, no matter how difficult it got, because she knew her strength was the only weapon she had. The more Monica tried to stand up for herself, the more she seemed to attract the attention of her classmates. It was as though her defiance had marked her even more clearly as a target. The students who had once simply watched Mr. Baker's treatment of her now seemed emboldened, as if they had been given silent permission to join in the harassment. It started with whispered comments and giggles that erupted whenever Monica walked by. Girls in the hallway would cover their mouths, pretending to whisper secrets, their eyes glittering with cruel amusement. "Watch out," one of them muttered one day as Monica passed. "Wouldn't want to catch whatever she has." The others burst into laughter, and Monica clenched her jaw, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the harassment soon escalated. In the cafeteria, Monica's usual spot became a hotspot for accidental spills and thrown food. One afternoon, as she sat down with her lunch tray, a boy named Jake, one of the most popular athletes in the school, tripped near her table, sending a carton of chocolate milk flying straight onto her backpack. Milk dripped from the canvas and pooled around her feet, and a chorus of laughter erupted around the room. "Oh, sorry," Jake drawled, not even trying to hide his smirk. "Guess I'm just clumsy today." Monica's hands trembled as she grabbed her ruined backpack, fighting back tears. She wanted to scream, to demand why they treated her this way, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she forced herself to walk out of the cafeteria with her head held high, her face burning with humiliation. The classroom wasn't any better. One afternoon, Monica returned to her desk to find that someone had scribbled a message on her notebook. "Why are you even here?" The letters were jagged, carved into the paper with enough force to tear the pages. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the words, but she carefully tore out the page, crumpled it up, and threw it away. During group projects, Monica often found herself excluded. Her classmates whispered among themselves, shooting her dismissive glances, and made it clear that they didn't want her involved. Once, a boy named Tyler outright refused to let her join his group, crossing his arms defiantly. "We don't need her dragging us down," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Monica stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding, before finding an empty seat and working alone. But the worst provocation came from a group of boys who had taken to calling her degrading nicknames. They followed her in the hallways, mimicking the way she walked or tossing offensive comments her way. "Hey, Monica," one of them jeered, "think you're some kind of hero? Maybe you should just go back to wherever you came from." The other boys laughed, pushing each other as if her misery were the greatest joke they'd ever heard. Monica knew that Mr. Baker saw some of this happening. He was never far away, his presence hovering like a shadow. But he did nothing to stop it. In fact, his silence seemed like a silent endorsement, a message that these students could get away with anything as long as it was directed at her. Monica's resolve was tested every single day. The provocation chipped away at her, leaving her exhausted and filled with a simmering anger she couldn't always suppress. But still, she refused to let them see her break. She had to stay strong, even when every step she took in that school felt like walking through a minefield. Art class had always been a sanctuary for Monica, a place where she could let her imagination and creativity run free. But in this new school, even that safe space was tainted by the tension that seemed to follow her everywhere. On this particular day, the students were given a simple assignment: create a painting that expressed something meaningful to them. For Monica, this was a chance to focus on something beautiful, to escape, even if only for a little while, from the constant hostility surrounding her. She sat at her desk, paints and brushes spread out in front of her, and allowed herself to get lost in the strokes and colors. Her brush moved rhythmically, layering shades of blue and gold into a portrait of resilience, a figure standing strong against a storm, their hair whipped by the wind but their feet rooted firmly to the ground. It was a vision that Monica felt deep within herself, a testament to the strength she was trying to hold on to. As she painted, a few students nearby threw her curious glances. Some whispered to each other, pointing and giggling, but Monica tuned them out. This was her world, her moment, and she wasn't going to let them take it from her. Then came the familiar, heavy footsteps of Mr. Baker. He strolled between the rows of desks, observing each student's work with a critical eye. When he reached Monica's desk, he paused, his presence casting a long shadow over her canvas. Monica's hand froze mid-stroke, and her heart began to race. "What do we have here?" Mr. Baker asked, his voice smooth but laced with disdain. He leaned over, examining her painting with a raised eyebrow. "Interesting choice of imagery, Miss Williams. Tell me, what are you trying to express?" Monica swallowed, feeling the weight of his gaze and the curious eyes of her classmates fixed on her. She knew this was a trap. No matter how she answered, Mr. Baker would find a way to twist her words, to make her feel small. But she couldn't let him win. "It's about standing strong," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Even when things are difficult. Even when it feels like everything is against you." Mr. Baker's lips curved into a cold, almost mocking smile. "Standing strong, you say?" he echoed. "Well, that's certainly ambitious." He straightened, addressing the whole class now. "You see, students, some people like to paint themselves as victims, always fighting some imaginary battle. But real strength doesn't come from playing the hero in your own narrative. It comes from knowing your place and working within the system." The words hit Monica like a slap, and she felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. The room was silent, her classmates watching with varying expressions, some shocked, some amused. Monica wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear from his condescending glare. But she forced herself to meet his eyes, refusing to let him see the hurt he had caused. Mr. Baker gave her one last, piercing look before moving on, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Monica clenched her paintbrush, her fingers trembling. Her sanctuary had been shattered, and she could feel the humiliation burning in her chest. But she took a deep breath, dipped her brush back into the paint, and continued her work. Her strokes were more forceful now, the colors bolder and angrier. She poured every ounce of her frustration and pain into the painting, transforming it into a powerful statement. She knew Mr. Baker wanted to crush her spirit, to make her believe that she was powerless. But she refused to let him take that from her. Even if she had to fight for it, she would keep standing strong, just like the figure in her painting, weathering the storm. The art class moved on, but the tension clung to Monica like a heavy cloak. Her classmates' laughter and whispered conversations seemed louder, sharper, cutting into her fragile sense of peace. She kept her head down, focusing on her painting, but inside, the frustration and humiliation Mr. Baker had planted were beginning to boil over. Her hands shook with anger as she added more colors to the stormy sky of her canvas, each stroke an outlet for the fury she struggled to contain. But then, just as she thought she had regained some control, she heard a loud, mocking voice from across the room. "Hey, Miss Williams." It was Jake, the same boy who had spilled milk on her in the cafeteria. He was standing beside his friend Tyler, both of them grinning like they had just heard the best joke of their lives. "What's the point of that painting?" Jake called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Trying to be some kind of hero, or just dreaming you are?" He mimicked her earlier explanation with exaggerated gestures, his mockery echoing through the room. Tyler and a few other students snickered, fueling the fire of Monica's growing rage. Monica gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on her brush until her knuckles turned white. She could feel her heart pounding, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her breathing quickened, and it felt like a knot of anger and pain was threatening to explode from her chest. Every ounce of restraint she had was slipping, worn thin by the relentless harassment and Mr. Baker's cruel authority. Before she could stop herself, Monica slammed her paintbrush onto the table, sending a splatter of paint across her canvas and onto the floor. The sudden noise cut through the classroom, and all eyes turned to her in surprise. Monica stood up, her body tense, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "Why do you all think it's okay?" she demanded, her voice louder than it had ever been. "Why do you think you can treat me like this? Just because you have nothing better to do?" Her eyes burned, and she felt the weight of every suppressed emotion flooding out, unstoppable. The room fell into a stunned silence. Jake and Tyler's smiles faltered, replaced with surprise and something almost like fear. Even Mr. Baker, who had been writing something on the board, turned around, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. For a moment, Monica stood there, her anger raw and exposed, her body trembling. But before she could say anything more, Mr. Baker's voice cut through the silence, cold and hard. "Miss Williams," he said, his tone dangerously calm, "sit down. Right now." Monica's heart sank, but the fire inside her still burned, defiant and unwilling to be extinguished. She met Mr. Baker's eyes, the authority in his glare crushing down on her, but she didn't back away. Her outburst had cost her, she knew it had only made things worse. But in that moment, she couldn't regret it. The years of enduring, the constant pressures to stay silent, it had all come pouring out, and she had let them see her pain. With a heavy heart, Monica sat back down, her hands still trembling. Mr. Baker's gaze lingered on her, his jaw tight with thinly veiled irritation. He looked as though he was relishing the thought of how he would make her pay for this act of rebellion. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably, the energy in the room crackling with unease. Monica felt the sting of regret, knowing the consequences would come. But part of her, a small, determined part, felt relief. For once, she had made herself heard, even if it cost her more than she could afford. The next day, Monica walked into school with a sense of dread weighing heavily on her shoulders. The memory of her outburst in art class still stung, and she knew she had made herself an even bigger target. As she entered Mr. Baker's history classroom, the room fell into an awkward silence, her classmates exchanging glances and whispering under their breath. Mr. Baker stood at the front of the class, his expression unreadable. But Monica could sense the storm brewing behind his cold eyes. She sat down at her desk, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She knew he wouldn't let her outburst go unpunished, and the anticipation made her stomach twist with anxiety. "Class," Mr. Baker began, his voice deceptively calm, "before we continue with today's lesson, there is something that needs to be addressed." He paused, letting the tension build, his eyes locking onto Monica. The silence was suffocating, and Monica could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning to her. "Yesterday," he continued, "we witnessed a blatant display of disrespect and defiance." His words were slow and deliberate, each one a sharpened blade aimed at her. "Certain students in this class seem to believe that they are above the rules, that they have the right to disrupt the learning environment with their outbursts and refusal to cooperate." Monica's face burned, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to look away. The room was so quiet that she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. "Miss Williams," Mr. Baker said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "your behavior yesterday was completely unacceptable. You disrespected not only your classmates but also this institution and its values. We do not tolerate insubordination in this school." The word insubordination stung, carrying an air of accusation that made Monica's chest tighten with indignation. Her hands curled into fists under her desk, and she struggled to keep her breathing steady. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that she had only spoken out because she was tired of the constant harassment, the constant injustice. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Mr. Baker had already decided she was the villain. "You will stay after class today to discuss the consequences of your actions," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "I hope you understand the gravity of your behavior and the example you're setting." Monica swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness filling her mouth. The accusations were heavy and unfair, a deliberate attempt to paint her as the problem, to make her the scapegoat for her own suffering. She could see the satisfaction in Mr. Baker's expression, the way he relished the power he held over her. He had twisted her act of self-defense into an act of rebellion, and now he was going to make sure she paid the price. Her classmates shifted uncomfortably, some of them avoiding her gaze, others watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. A few even looked smug, clearly enjoying the spectacle of her public reprimand. Monica felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her, the realization that she was fighting this battle almost entirely alone. When the lesson finally resumed, Monica sat in silence, her mind racing with a mix of anger and helplessness. She had tried to stand up for herself, and now she was being punished for it, accused of being a troublemaker simply for refusing to stay silent. But even as the frustration and fear churned inside her, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to keep fighting, even if every step forward came with its own set of painful consequences. The days that followed Mr. Baker's public reprimand were nothing short of a nightmare for Monica. It seemed as though her outburst had given both the teacher and her classmates a renewed sense of purpose, to break her spirit completely. The humiliation and harassment intensified, chipping away at the fragile defenses she had managed to build. In class, Mr. Baker found new and subtle ways to target her. During lessons, he would call on her repeatedly, demanding answers in a tone that was almost mocking. When she answered correctly, he would dismiss her with a condescending nod, as though he were surprised she had managed to string together a coherent thought. And if she ever hesitated or stumbled, even for a second, he would sigh loudly, shaking his head in disappointment. "Miss Williams," he sneered one day, after she struggled to answer a complex question about historical events, "it's a wonder you're even here. Are you sure you're paying attention, or is this material simply beyond your grasp?" The class snickered, and Monica felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to sink into her chair and disappear, but she forced herself to remain still, clinging desperately to whatever dignity she had left. But Mr. Baker wasn't the only source of her torment. Her classmates, emboldened by his open disdain, followed suit with their own cruel tactics. They began to leave cruel notes on her desk, scrawled in jagged, angry letters. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." Each note felt like a dagger, a message that cut straight to her heart. One morning, Monica arrived to find that someone had dumped trash into her locker. Torn up papers, crumpled snack wrappers, and even a spilled juice box lay scattered among her books and belongings. She stared at the mess, her hands trembling, and fought back the tears that stung her eyes. Laughter echoed down the hall, and she turned to see a group of students watching her with smug, satisfied smiles. Monica clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and silently began to clean up the mess. In the cafeteria, her usual spot was no longer safe. Jake and Tyler had taken to sitting nearby, making loud, mocking remarks about her as they laughed with their friends. They would throw bits of food in her direction, making sure that no teacher ever saw them do it. Once, a piece of bread landed on her tray, splattering her lunch. The table erupted into laughter, and Monica felt the sting of humiliation so deeply that she could hardly breathe. Her appetite was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread that twisted her stomach into knots. The isolation was the worst part. Even the few students who might have shown her kindness were too afraid to speak up or stand by her side. It was as though she had become a walking symbol of what happened when someone dared to challenge the status quo. People avoided her in the hallways, giving her wide berths and pretending she didn't exist. She had never felt so alone. One day, during gym class, things took an even darker turn. The students were playing a game of dodgeball, and Monica tried her best to stay out of the way, hoping to avoid any more trouble. But Tyler and his friends had other plans. They deliberately aimed the rubber balls at her with extra force, targeting her with a malicious glee that made her heart race with fear. One of the balls struck her hard in the shoulder, and she stumbled backward, her vision blurring with pain. "Whoops!" Tyler called out, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Didn't see you there, Williams." His friends erupted into laughter, and Monica bit down on her lip so hard she tasted blood. The gym teacher didn't even look in her direction, too busy with his clipboard to notice, or maybe choosing to ignore it altogether. Monica's spirit was fraying. Each day, the humiliation grew, and each day, she had to summon every ounce of strength she had just to keep going. The weight of their cruelty pressed down on her, a relentless force that threatened to crush her completely. But even as the tears threatened to spill, she whispered to herself that she couldn't let them win. She had come too far to give up now. Even if her heart was breaking a little more each day, Monica began to study her classmates more closely, hoping to find some hint of solidarity or understanding in their eyes. But what she discovered instead was a spectrum of indifference, fear, and, in some cases, twisted enjoyment of her suffering. The realization left a bitter taste in her mouth. Some of her peers seemed to relish her humiliation. Jake and Tyler, of course, were at the forefront, openly mocking her whenever they had the chance. They were loud and unapologetic, feeding off each other's energy, their laughter echoing through the hallways. But it wasn't just them. Monica could see others who smiled quietly or stifled laughter when something cruel was said or done to her, as if her misery was some form of entertainment. Other classmates watched everything unfold with nervous, darting eyes. They didn't participate in the bullying, but their silence made them complicit. Monica could see the way they avoided eye contact when Mr. Baker belittled her, the way they turned away when Jake and his friends targeted her. These students seemed uncomfortable, but they never spoke up or intervened. Their fear of becoming the next target kept them from doing anything, and Monica couldn't help but feel betrayed by their inaction. They had the power to stand with her, to make a difference, but they chose to stay on the sidelines, protected by their silence. A few of her classmates looked at her with something akin to pity. Emily, the girl who had once shared a brief, kind smile with Monica, seemed torn. Monica would catch Emily glancing at her during class, her expression filled with guilt and worry, but Emily never approached her again. The weight of social pressure was too strong, and Monica knew that any attempt to befriend her would come at a high cost. It was in the moments between classes, when Monica walked alone through the crowded halls, that she felt the full force of her isolation. The way people moved around her, like she was a ghost, invisible and unwanted, cut deeper than any words could. The conversation she overheard, whispers that she was looking for trouble, that she should just stop trying to stand out, reinforced the idea that she was the problem, that she was somehow responsible for the cruelty she faced. But there was one thing Monica couldn't ignore, the way some students looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. In their eyes, she saw curiosity, confusion, even admiration. There were those who recognized the courage it took for her to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against her. It gave her a sliver of hope, a tiny reminder that not everyone saw her as an outsider. Still, the sense of betrayal and disappointment in her classmates was overwhelming. Monica had always believed that people, deep down, wanted to do the right thing. But here, in the microcosm of high school, the social order seemed immovable. People stayed in their lanes, unwilling to risk their own comfort for someone else's well-being. Monica's heart ached for the support she so desperately needed but could not find. Her classmates had become a reflection of the world she was fighting against, a world that preferred to look the other way, a world content to let injustice continue if it meant avoiding conflict. Yet even in this sea of indifference, Monica reminded herself that she had to keep pushing forward, if only to prove that she wouldn't be erased so easily. One rainy afternoon, Monica made her way to art class, her footsteps heavy with fatigue. The day had already been draining. Mr. Baker had humiliated her in front of everyone during history, and Jake and Tyler had bumped into her accidentally in the hallway, causing her to drop her books. By the time she reached the art room, she was clinging to her last shred of resolve. She sat down at her usual spot, setting her art supplies out in a neat line, trying to focus on the small comfort that painting usually brought her. The teacher, Mr. Collins, had yet to arrive, and the room was buzzing with the low hum of conversation. Monica tried to tune it out, determined to lose herself in her work for just a little while. But as she reached for her paintbrush, she noticed something strange. Her hands froze, her heart skipping a beat. There, on her desk, was a large, open can of paint, its contents an alarming, bright red. The thick liquid had already spilled, spreading across the wooden surface and dripping onto the floor. The vivid color looked almost like blood, and for a moment, Monica was too shocked to react. Laughter erupted from the back of the room, and Monica's head snapped up to see Jake, Tyler, and a few others doubled over, their faces twisted with amusement. "Looks like you've got an accident on your hands, Williams," Jake called out, his voice loud and mocking. The others joined in, their laughter echoing off the walls. Monica's hands began to shake, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The red paint had seeped onto her own supplies, ruining her sketchbook and smearing across her pencils. The sight was grotesque, a symbol of yet another violation, another attack meant to humiliate and destroy her. She swallowed hard, feeling her pulse hammering in her ears. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the laughter growing louder, harsher. Anger and shame twisted inside her, battling for control, and tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. But she forced herself not to cry, not in front of them. She couldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and grabbed a stack of paper towels from the supply closet. As she began to clean up the mess, her hands trembled so badly that she almost dropped the towels. The paint smeared across her skin, staining her fingers a garish red, and she struggled to keep her composure. Each wipe felt futile, as though she were trying to erase something that would never truly be gone. "Ah, don't look so sad," Tyler said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Red's a good color on you." More laughter followed, and Monica's grip on the paper towels tightened until her knuckles turned white. Monica kept her head down, forcing herself to keep cleaning, even as the humiliation burned through her. The other students either watched with uncomfortable expressions or pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their own work. No one stepped in to help, and no one spoke up for her. She was completely alone in this nightmare, surrounded by people who either enjoyed her suffering or refused to see it. Just as she finished wiping up the last of the paint, Mr. Collins finally walked into the room, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded. He glanced at Monica, noting the mess and the red stains on her hands, and frowned slightly. "Monica, what happened here?" he asked, his voice neutral but tinged with annoyance. Monica's throat felt tight, and she struggled to find her voice. "It was an accident," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew that if she tried to explain, it would only make things worse. The laughter had already died down, and Jake and Tyler were sitting innocently, as though nothing had happened. Mr. Collins sighed, clearly impatient. "Clean yourself up and try to be more careful next time," he said, already moving on to the day's lesson. Monica nodded numbly, her heart heavy. As she made her way to the sink to wash off the paint, she felt the last fragments of her patience and strength slipping away. The red stains clung to her skin, no matter how hard she scrubbed, a cruel reminder that the cruelty she faced was something she couldn't simply wash away. The tension in Monica's life had been building like a coiled spring, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped. The events of the previous days had worn her down to the point where she was running on nothing but sheer willpower, a determination to keep going despite the constant onslaught. But sometimes, sheer willpower wasn't enough to withstand the cruelty that surrounded her. It happened during gym class, a time that Monica had come to dread more than anything else. The class was playing a game of basketball, and as usual, Monica tried to stay on the fringes, doing her best to avoid drawing attention to herself. But her efforts to remain invisible only seemed to provoke more attention from those who had made it their mission to torment her. Jake and Tyler were on the opposing team, and it didn't take long for them to start targeting her. They exchanged knowing glances, grins spreading across their faces, as if they had been waiting for this moment all day. Jake, with his tall, athletic build, dribbled the ball down the court with ease, and Monica could see the look of mischief in his eyes as he approached her. "Hey, Williams!" Jake shouted, his voice full of mocking energy. "Think fast." With that, he hurled the basketball toward her, far harder than necessary. Monica barely had time to react. The ball struck her square in the chest, knocking the wind out of her. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, as laughter erupted around her. The impact left a sharp, throbbing pain in her ribs, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Tyler joined in, clapping his hands together in fake sympathy. "Ah, did that hurt?" "Maybe you should pay more attention, Williams," he jeered. The other students watched with a mix of shock and amusement, some of them laughing along, others shifting uncomfortably but saying nothing. Monica's vision blurred with tears of pain and anger. She wanted to scream, to shove Jake and Tyler, to demand why they found so much joy in hurting her. But before she could do anything, before she could even catch her breath, Mr. Rogers, the gym teacher, blew his whistle sharply and jogged over. "What's going on here?" Mr. Rogers demanded, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Monica, who was hunched over, clutching her chest, and then at Jake, who had the nerve to put on an innocent face. "It was just an accident, Coach," Jake said smoothly, spreading his hands as if he couldn't believe he was being questioned. "Didn't mean to throw it that hard." Tyler nodded along, looking equally innocent. Monica straightened up, her face flushed with pain and humiliation. The fury bubbling inside her was almost too much to contain. She wanted to shout that it wasn't an accident, that this was just one more deliberate act of cruelty. But Mr. Rogers only sighed, already seeming tired of the whole ordeal. Be more careful next time, Jake, he said, his voice lacking any real authority. He didn't even look at Monica as he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the pain still radiating through her chest. That was the moment Monica's anger boiled over, the moment she couldn't hold back anymore. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. Why, she burst out, her voice cracking. Why is it always me? Why does no one ever do anything about it? The laughter died down, and the gym fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jake and Tyler exchanged glances, surprised by her sudden outburst, but they quickly recovered, smirking at her with that same infuriating arrogance. Relax, Williams, Jake said, his voice dripping with mockery. You're making a scene. Monica's whole body shook with anger, and she could feel tears streaming down her face. But she was done holding it in. I'm tired of this, she said, her voice trembling. I'm tired of all of you thinking it's okay to treat me like this. Before anyone could respond, Mr. Rogers blew his whistle again. Enough, Miss Williams, he said, his tone irritated. Stop disrupting the class and get back in line. Monica's heart felt like it was being crushed. Even now, even after everything, she was the one being blamed, the one being told to fall back in line. Her shoulders slumped, and she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. The laughter resumed, quieter this time, but just as cruel, and Monica realized with a sinking feeling that nothing had changed. The aggression, the pain, the humiliation, it was all still there, and she was still alone. The aftermath of Monica's outburst in gym class lingered in the air like an electric charge, crackling with tension. The laughter that had erupted moments before now faded into an uneasy silence, and everyone seemed to freeze. Monica stood there, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, her fists still clenched at her sides. The tears she had tried so hard to hold back now glistened on her cheeks, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being completely exposed. The gymnasium, once filled with the sounds of bouncing basketballs and squeaking sneakers, had become a place where time seemed to stop. Monica's classmates stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, discomfort, and curiosity. Even Jake and Tyler, who had taken so much joy in tormenting her, seemed momentarily stunned. Their smug grins faltered, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed their faces. Mr. Rogers, the gym teacher, stood with his whistle hanging from his lips, his brow furrowed. For a split second, he seemed at a loss for words, as though Monica's raw anger had caught him off guard. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, and he looked at her with a mixture of frustration and confusion, as if he couldn't understand why she was making such a fuss. The silence pressed down on Monica like a weight, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the eyes of her classmates boring into her, judging her, dissecting her pain as though it were something to be analyzed or pitted. The humiliation was a crushing force, wrapping itself around her and making her feel small, powerless, and utterly alone. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, a sign of understanding, but found none. Emily, the girl who had once shown her a hint of kindness, looked away, her expression full of discomfort. Other students averted their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in anything but the scene unfolding before them. No one stepped forward to offer support or comfort. No one dared to challenge the status quo. Monica's chest ached with the sting of betrayal and isolation. The frozen silence was more painful than any insult or act of aggression. It was a silence that screamed indifference, a silence that declared she was on her own in this fight. Her outburst had revealed her vulnerability, and now she felt like an open wound, exposed and raw for all to see. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Rogers cleared his throat, his voice sounding hollow in the empty stillness. "All right," he said, his tone forced and impatient. "Everyone back to what you were doing. Let's not waste any more time." The spell was broken, and slowly, the students began to move again, though the air remained thick with tension. Jake and Tyler exchanged glances, their cocky demeanor returning, but they didn't say anything else. The other students resumed their activities, but the energy in the gym had changed. Monica could feel it, a quiet, persistent awareness that everyone had witnessed her moment of vulnerability. She wiped her face with her sleeve, her hand still trembling. The silence had left a mark, a deep wound that wouldn't heal easily. As she walked back to her spot, she felt her knees weaken, her body heavy with exhaustion and defeat. The gym class continued around her, but she felt as though she were moving in slow motion, trapped in a world that didn't care about her pain. The silence had spoken volumes, and the message was clear. Monica was still alone. The silence that had hung heavy in the gym, suffocating and tense, shattered suddenly and violently, pierced by a burst of cruel, mocking laughter. It was Jake who started it, a loud, barking laugh that echoed off the walls and reverberated through the cavernous space. The sound was jarring, cutting through the fragile moment like a knife and making Monica flinch. "Wow, Williams," Jake jeered, wiping fake tears from his eyes as he continued to laugh. "That was some performance. Maybe you should take up acting instead of trying to play the victim all the time." His voice was laced with sarcasm, dripping with malicious delight. The laughter spread quickly, infecting Tyler and a few others who joined in, snickering and pointing in Monica's direction. The eruption of laughter felt like a physical blow, and Monica's heart sank, her cheeks flushing with renewed embarrassment. Her hands trembled, and she tried to steady her breathing, but the humiliation was overwhelming. The vulnerability she had shown, the pain she had voiced, had been twisted into a source of entertainment for them, and now her anguish was their punchline. Even the students who weren't laughing didn't come to her defense. Some looked down at their feet, pretending to be busy adjusting their shoelaces or fiddling with the hem of their gym shorts. Others exchanged awkward glances, their discomfort palpable but their silence just as painful. No one stepped forward to stand beside her, no one spoke up to call out the cruelty. Monica's chest tightened, and she fought to keep her tears at bay. The laughter felt endless, ringing in her ears and echoing in her mind, each peal chipping away at her fragile sense of self. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the way it dismissed her completely, turning her suffering into a joke for others to enjoy. "Look at her," Tyler added, his voice dripping with disdain. "She thought she could just yell and make all her problems go away." His words stung like salt in an open wound, and Monica had to bite down on the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. The laughter seemed to grow louder, a cacophony of ridicule that threatened to drown her. Mr. Rogers blew his whistle again, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. "Enough," he barked, his tone full of irritation. "This is a gym class, not a comedy show. Get back to your drills, all of you." The laughter subsided reluctantly, though smirks and giggles still lingered among the students. Jake and Tyler exchanged knowing glances, clearly pleased with themselves, as they jogged back to their positions on the court. Monica stood frozen, the weight of their cruelty pressing down on her. The gym seemed to blur around her, the walls closing in as she struggled to regain control of her emotions. The laughter had torn through her defenses, leaving her feeling hollow and exposed. Her body felt heavy, her heart aching with a mix of anger and despair. She clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She knew she couldn't break down here, couldn't let them see her cry again. But the pain of being laughed at, of being reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for their amusement, felt unbearable. Taking a shaky breath, Monica forced herself to move, each step feeling like a struggle as she tried to piece herself back together in the face of their relentless mockery. The laughter may have died down, but the echoes of it still reverberated in Monica's mind, a cruel reminder of her isolation and vulnerability. Her body felt as if it had been drained of all energy, her legs trembling with every step she took. Each breath was shallow, and a suffocating sense of despair gripped her chest, making it hard to think, hard to focus on anything but the aching sense of loneliness. As gym class ended, Monica shuffled to the locker room, trying to hold herself together. The other girls filed in around her, chattering and laughing as if nothing had happened. Monica found a spot at the far end of the locker room and sank onto the bench, her head hanging low. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, tried to steady the shaking in her hands, but the hopelessness was overwhelming. And then, without warning, the pressure building inside her finally erupted. Monica let out a strangled, desperate sob, the sound tearing from her throat before she could stop it. The noise cut through the locker room, startling a few girls who paused mid-conversation to look at her. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back the flood of emotions any longer. "Why won't anyone help me?" she choked out, her voice breaking. The words spilled out, raw and full of pain. "Why does no one care? What did I do to deserve this?" Her cries echoed in the small space, each one filled with a desperate longing for someone, anyone, to see her, to reach out and make the nightmare stop. For a moment, the locker room fell into an uncomfortable hush, and Monica's sobs seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud. A few girls exchanged uneasy glances, their faces filled with pity and discomfort. Emily, the girl who had once shown Monica a hint of kindness, took a step forward, her expression conflicted. But then she hesitated, her eyes darting to her friends, who were already looking away, shifting awkwardly. No one came to Monica's side. No one offered a comforting hand or a kind word. The silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy, and Monica felt her heart shatter a little more. Her cries of desperation had been met with nothing but indifference, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Monica's vision blurred with tears, and she let her hands fall to her sides, her sobs turning into silent, exhausted gasps. She had tried to be strong, to fight, to keep standing despite everything. But now, sitting there in the locker room, surrounded by people who either didn't care or were too afraid to care, she felt completely defeated. The girls began to move again, resuming their conversations as if nothing had happened. They avoided looking at Monica, as though her pain was something contagious, something they couldn't afford to acknowledge. The chatter resumed, and the sound of lockers slamming shut filled the room, drowning out the last echoes of Monica's broken cries. Monica hugged herself tightly, her body racked with silent sobs. Her cry for help had been swallowed by the apathy of those around her, and she was left feeling more alone than ever. The world felt colder, darker, and she wondered if anyone would ever care enough to stand with her, to hear her, and take her pain seriously. Monica walked through the hallways after gym class, her head bowed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The pain in her chest hadn't lessened, but she forced herself to keep moving, to put one foot in front of the other. The school day wasn't over, and she still had to endure more. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the relentless sense of injustice that surrounded her. It was as if the whole world was conspiring against her, determined to push her to the brink. No matter how hard she tried to be strong, no matter how fiercely she fought to keep her dignity, it never seemed to be enough. The cruelty from her classmates, the mockery from Jake and Tyler, the silent complicity of everyone else, all of it felt like an endless cycle that she couldn't escape. But the worst injustice of all came when she reached her next class, history with Mr. Baker. The very room that had become a crucible of her suffering now awaited her with yet another trial. Monica took a deep breath, trying to compose herself before stepping inside. As she walked to her seat, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some of them still smirking, others looking away as if they didn't want to get involved. Mr. Baker stood at the front of the room, organizing his notes. He glanced up as Monica entered, his expression hardening. The cold disdain in his eyes was unmistakable, and Monica braced herself for whatever new humiliation he had in store for her. She had learned to expect it by now, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Before class could even start, Mr. Baker called Monica's name. His voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the other students. "Miss Williams," he said, his eyes narrowing, "a word, please." Monica's stomach twisted, but she nodded, rising from her seat and walking to the front of the class. The room went silent, her classmates watching the scene unfold with morbid curiosity. Mr. Baker crossed his arms, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "I heard there was an incident in gym class today," he began, his voice full of that familiar condescension. "An outburst, I believe. Care to explain yourself?" Monica's heart pounded, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She knew there was no point in trying to defend herself. Even if she explained how she had been pushed to her breaking point, how the bullying and harassment had worn her down to nothing, Mr. Baker wouldn't care. He never cared. I was upset," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I've been dealing with—" Mr. Baker cut her off, his eyes narrowing further. "Spare me the excuses, Miss Williams. This behavior is unacceptable, and I won't tolerate disruptions in this school. If you can't control your emotions, perhaps you should reconsider how you conduct yourself." The words hit her like a blow, and Monica felt her throat tighten with rage and frustration. How could he stand there, acting like she was the problem? How could he ignore everything that had led her to that point, the months of torment, the isolation, the cruelty? It was an injustice so glaring, so painful, that she felt like she might explode. "But it's not fair," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "I'm the one being hurt, and no one does anything about it. Why is it always me who gets blamed? Mr. Baker's expression darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Life isn't fair, Miss Williams. Perhaps it's time you learned that lesson. Now take your seat. Monica swallowed hard, the injustice of his words nearly suffocating her. The anger and despair twisted inside her, a storm that had nowhere to go. She turned and walked back to her desk, her face flushed with humiliation, her body trembling. The other students watched, some of them smirking, others pretending not to notice. The unfairness of it all made her feel sick, like she was trapped in a nightmare where no one cared about the truth. As she sat down, Monica felt the tears welling up again, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't give them that satisfaction, even though her heart felt like it was breaking under the weight of so much cruelty, so much relentless injustice. That evening, Monica sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing her food around on her plate. Her parents, David and Angela Williams, watched her with growing concern. They had noticed the change in her demeanor over the past few months. The once bright and energetic girl they knew had become withdrawn, her eyes shadowed with an exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Angela set down her fork, her expression softening with worry. Monica, she said gently, is everything okay at school? The question was loaded with concern, a mother's intuition picking up on the pain her daughter was trying so desperately to hide. Monica hesitated, her fork pausing mid-motion. Her parents had always been her support system, her safe haven. But the weight of everything she had endured felt too heavy to put into words. She had tried so hard to carry it on her own, to shield them from the ugliness of what she was going through. But now, sitting there in the warmth of their kitchen, she felt her resolve start to crack. David leaned forward, his brow furrowed. We've noticed you've been struggling, he said carefully. You can talk to us, sweetheart. Whatever it is, we're here for you. Monica's eyes filled with tears, and she bit her lip, trying to keep them from falling. The kindness and love in her parents' eyes broke through the wall she had built to protect herself. She set her fork down, her hands trembling, and took a deep breath. It's been really hard, she whispered. School is horrible. People are mean. And no one does anything about it. Angela reached out and took Monica's hand in hers, her grip gentle but firm. What do you mean, honey? She asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Are you being bullied? Monica's shoulders slumped, and she nodded, the tears finally spilling over. Yes, she choked out. It's been going on for months. The students, they say awful things, they humiliate me. And the teachers, they don't care. Mr. Baker, he's the worst. He makes me feel like it's all my fault. David's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. He exchanged a look with Angela, whose face had gone pale with worry. They both knew how cruel the world could be, but hearing that their daughter had been facing this alone filled them with a fierce, protective rage. Angela pulled Monica into a hug, holding her close as she cried. Oh, baby, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you've been going through this. She stroked Monica's hair, her heart breaking with each sob that shook her daughter's body. You don't have to go through this alone. We're going to do something about it, I promise. David stood up, pacing the kitchen with a look of determination on his face. We're going to the school, he declared. We're going to talk to the principal, the teachers, anyone we need to. This stops now. Monica pulled back from her mother's embrace, wiping her eyes. But what if it just makes things worse? She asked, her voice small and fearful. The thought of more retaliation, more pain, made her stomach twist with anxiety. David knelt down beside her, his eyes filled with unwavering resolve. We won't let that happen, he said firmly. You deserve to feel safe, to be treated with respect. We won't stand by and let them hurt you anymore. Monica looked into her parents' eyes and felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. Her parents' love and support surrounded her like a shield, and for a moment, the darkness that had been suffocating her lifted just a little. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew the fight for justice would be difficult. But with her parents by her side, Monica felt a small spark of strength reignite within her. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The school administration began its so-called investigation the very next day, but to Monica, it felt more like a hollow gesture than a real attempt to address the injustices she had suffered. The process seemed designed to protect the school's reputation rather than uncover the truth. Still, the investigation was underway, and Monica clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, it would lead to some kind of justice. Mrs. Daniels had made a show of meeting with various students, including Jake and Tyler, who left her office looking as smug as ever. Monica overheard them joking in the hallways, confident that they would face no real consequences. Just had to tell them what they wanted to hear, Jake sneered to his friends. They're not gonna do anything. The administration also spoke to teachers, including Mr. Baker, who had his own version of events ready. He painted himself as a dedicated educator, trying to manage a difficult and disruptive student who refused to respect authority. Monica knew his words carried weight. He had years of experience and the backing of a system that rarely questioned the authority of its staff. When it was Monica's turn to give her statement, she sat in Mrs. Daniels' office, her hands trembling. Her parents sat beside her, their presence a reassuring force, but the principal's scrutinizing gaze made her feel small and nervous. Monica recounted the incidents in detail, describing the constant harassment from her classmates and the calculated cruelty of Mr. Baker. She spoke about the paint dumped on her desk, the basketball thrown at her, the cruel laughter in the locker room, and the countless moments of humiliation in class. Mrs. Daniels listened, her expression giving nothing away. When Monica finished, there was a moment of silence that felt agonizingly long. Finally, the principal sighed. "Monica, these are serious accusations," she said, her voice careful but not entirely empathetic. "But you have to understand that we need evidence beyond just your testimony." Monica's heart sank. "I'm telling the truth," she said, her voice cracking. "You can ask other students. They've seen what's been happening." Mrs. Daniels nodded. "We will, but as you know, not all students are willing to speak up. Sometimes it's difficult to get a full picture." Her words were like a blow, making Monica feel as though her pain was just another inconvenience to be brushed aside. The investigation dragged on for days, and Monica watched as the school administration tiptoed around the truth, careful not to disrupt the status quo. A few students were interviewed, but most of them offered vague or noncommittal answers. Some were too afraid of retaliation from Jake and his friends, while others simply claimed they hadn't noticed anything unusual. The system protected itself, and Monica felt that no matter how much she spoke up, her voice was being drowned out by a tide of indifference. One afternoon, Emily approached Monica in the hallway, her face pale with guilt. "They asked me about what happened in gym class," Emily whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. "I wanted to say something, I really did, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry, Monica." Monica nodded, trying to keep her disappointment from showing. She understood the fear that kept people silent, but it didn't make the betrayal any less painful. "It's okay," she said quietly, though it didn't feel okay at all. Emily walked away, and Monica felt another piece of hope slip through her fingers. Even with her parents pushing for accountability, the investigation seemed to stall. Mrs. Daniels insisted that they were doing everything they could, but Monica could see the truth. The school cared more about protecting its image than protecting her. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. But Monica wasn't ready to give up entirely. If the system wouldn't fight for her, she would have to find another way. Even as the investigation dragged on, she clung to the belief that her voice still mattered, and she began to think about how she could make it heard beyond the walls of a school that refused to listen. As the investigation dragged on, Monica began to sense a shift, a subtle but insidious change in the way she was being treated. The murmurs in the hallways grew louder, and the stares she had become used to turned into looks of suspicion. It wasn't long before Monica realized the school administration had begun to spin the narrative, and somehow, she was becoming the one at fault. Rumors started circulating, whispers that Monica was overreacting, that she was causing trouble for the sake of attention. Some students claimed she was trying to get Mr. Baker fired out of spite, or that she was exaggerating the bullying to make herself look like a victim. The story twisted and contorted, and Monica felt trapped in a web of lies she couldn't control. One day, during lunch, Monica was called to the office again. Her heart pounded as she made her way there, dread building with each step. Inside, she found not only Mrs. Daniels and Mr. Baker, but also a few members of the school board who had been called in to discuss the case. The atmosphere was tense, and Monica's parents were already there, sitting stiffly with worry etched on their faces. Mrs. Daniels folded her hands and looked at Monica with a stern expression. "Monica," she began, "we've been reviewing the situation carefully, and some concerning information has come to our attention. Several students have come forward with statements suggesting that your behavior has been disruptive and, at times, intentionally provocative." Monica's eyes widened in disbelief. "Provocative?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "I'm the one who's been bullied. I've done nothing but try to defend myself." Mr. Baker cleared his throat, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "The students claim that you made accusations without substantial evidence," he said coolly, "and that your actions, such as your outburst in gym class, have disrupted the learning environment for everyone." Monica felt her knees go weak, and she clutched the edge of the chair to steady herself. "I had an outburst because I was pushed to the brink," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been harassed and humiliated for months, and no one has done anything to stop it." Mrs. Daniels' lips pressed into a thin line. "Regardless," she said, "we have to consider the impact your behavior has had on the school community. Several teachers, including Mr. Baker, have expressed concern about the way you've handled these situations." Monica's parents immediately leapt to her defense. David's voice was firm, filled with righteous anger. "This is absurd," he said. "You're punishing our daughter for standing up for herself? After everything she's endured?" Angela's voice trembled with fury. "Monica has been bullied relentlessly, and you're accusing her of being disruptive? This is exactly the problem. We came here for justice, and you're trying to turn her into the villain." But Mrs. Daniels remained unmoved. "We are trying to maintain a balanced perspective," she insisted. "Monica, we will continue our investigation, but you must understand that your behavior has consequences. We expect all students to adhere to the school's standards of respect and discipline." Monica's vision blurred with tears, a storm of rage and helplessness surging through her. She had come to this school seeking safety, and now she was being painted as the problem, as though she had brought this nightmare upon herself. The weight of the accusations crushed her, leaving her feeling powerless. When the meeting ended, Monica and her parents walked out of the office, their anger and disbelief radiating around them. Monica's heart ached, and the betrayal stung like a wound that wouldn't heal. She had tried to tell the truth, to shine a light on the cruelty she had endured, but now that truth had been twisted, and she was left feeling more alone than ever. As the days went on, Monica's spirit seemed to sink lower and lower, weighed down by the school's efforts to blame her for her own suffering. But just when she thought she had no more fight left, something unexpected began to happen. Word of her story started spreading beyond the walls of the school, and the people who cared about justice and truth took notice. It began with a single social media post. Emily, the same girl who had hesitated to speak up in the past, wrote a heartfelt message about what she had witnessed. She described the bullying, the paint incident, the harassment in gym class, and the way Mr. Baker had humiliated Monica over and over again. "I've stayed silent for too long," Emily wrote. "But seeing Monica suffer has made me realize that silence is complicity. She needs our support, and it's time for all of us to speak out." The post went viral within hours. Students from other schools, teachers, and even community members began sharing it, expressing outrage over Monica's treatment. People who had never even met Monica felt a surge of empathy for the brave girl who had endured so much. Comments flooded in, condemning the school's failure to protect her and demanding accountability. The ripple effect spread even further. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing Monica's parents and highlighting the injustices she had faced. Journalists showed up at the school, pressing the administration for answers, and a community-wide conversation about bullying and institutional neglect began to take shape. The pressure was mounting, and the school could no longer ignore it. Monica couldn't believe what she was seeing. Messages of support poured in from people all over, strangers who reached out to tell her how brave she was, how her story had moved them to take action. Parents of other students wrote letters to the school board, demanding change and insisting that Monica be treated with the respect she deserved. Activists from local organizations offered to help, rallying behind her and promising to hold the administration accountable. One afternoon, Monica and her parents were invited to a community meeting organized by parents, teachers, and local activists. When they arrived, Monica was stunned to see a crowd of people who had come to support her. They held signs that read, "Justice for Monica" and "Stand Against Bullying." The room was filled with an energy she hadn't felt in so long: hope, solidarity, and strength. Angela and David held Monica's hands as they stepped forward to speak. Tears welled up in Monica's eyes as she heard person after person share words of encouragement and outrage. Emily stood up, her voice shaking but determined, and publicly apologized for not speaking up sooner. "Monica," she said, "I'm so sorry for not being there when you needed me. But I'm here now, and so are all of us." Monica's voice trembled as she finally addressed the crowd. "Thank you," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you for seeing me, for listening, and for believing me when it felt like no one else did. I've been so afraid, so alone, but seeing all of you here, it means more than I can say." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long while, Monica felt a weight lift from her chest. The community had rallied around her, and she was no longer fighting this battle alone. Her pain had ignited a fire in others, a movement that demanded change. The strength of the community gave her a renewed sense of purpose, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for justice. The fight wasn't over, but now Monica had an army behind her, and together, they would make sure her voice was heard. The community's support ignited a wave of action that Monica and her family had only dreamed of. With the pressure mounting on the school administration, Monica's parents decided that it was time to take a more formal stand. They consulted with a lawyer, a passionate advocate named Julia Bennett, who specialized in cases involving school negligence and discrimination. Julia was fiercely committed to justice, and she believed that Monica deserved to have her voice heard in a courtroom. The decision to file a lawsuit against the school and Mr. Baker was not made lightly. Monica was nervous about what it would mean, how her life might change, how much scrutiny she would face, but she knew she had to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for all the other students who had suffered in silence. Her parents stood by her side, unwavering in their support, as the case was officially filed. The news sent shockwaves through the school community. The administration scrambled to defend itself, and Mr. Baker, for the first time, seemed rattled. He had grown so accustomed to his power and control, and now he was being called to account for his actions in a public, undeniable way. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and Monica sat beside her parents in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together. Julia sat on the other side, her demeanor calm and composed, but her eyes blazing with determination. Across the aisle, the school's legal team looked equally prepared, their expressions guarded. The courtroom was packed with supporters, members of the community who had come to show solidarity. Emily sat near the front, her face filled with hope and determination, and a few teachers who believed in Monica had also come, finally ready to speak the truth. Reporters lined the back of the room, their cameras poised to capture every moment. Julia began the proceedings with a powerful opening statement, outlining the systematic failure of the school to protect Monica from relentless bullying and the repeated acts of psychological harm inflicted by Mr. Baker. She described the ongoing trauma Monica had endured and how the administration had not only ignored her cries for help but had also turned her into the scapegoat. Monica held her breath as Julia presented evidence, witness statements, photographs of the messages and vandalism she had faced, and accounts from students who had seen the harassment firsthand. Emily was called to the stand, and she bravely recounted the incidents she had witnessed, her voice trembling but firm. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, her eyes filled with guilt. "But I'm here now because Monica deserves justice." Then came Mr. Baker's turn to testify. His demeanor was different from the one he wore in the classroom, more guarded, more careful. He denied the accusations, claiming that his actions had always been in the interest of discipline and education. But as Julia cross-examined him, the cracks in his story began to show. His attempts to justify his behavior fell flat, and even some of the school's defenders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The school's defense team argued that the administration had done everything within reason to address Monica's concerns, but Julia countered with evidence that the school had repeatedly failed to act. Each argument was met with a counterpoint that highlighted the school's negligence and the culture of silence it had perpetuated. Monica's heart raced as the day unfolded, but she drew strength from the faces of her supporters. The community's presence reminded her that she was no longer fighting alone. This was bigger than her. This was about standing up to a broken system that had allowed cruelty and indifference to fester. When the hearing ended for the day, Monica felt exhausted but hopeful. Her parents hugged her tightly, and Julia reassured them that they had presented a strong case. "We're making them listen, Monica," Julia said, her eyes warm with encouragement. "This is only the beginning, but we're on the right path." As they left the courthouse, reporters called out questions, but Monica held her head high. She knew the journey was far from over, and there would be more challenges ahead. But she also knew that her fight for justice had sparked something powerful, something that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom battle was a turning point, and Monica was ready to see it through, no matter how long it took. The following days in court were crucial, as witnesses began to take the stand to testify about the bullying and harassment Monica had faced. Each testimony brought new layers to the story, illuminating the toxic environment of the school and the negligence of those in power. Monica sat between her parents, her hands clasped tightly together, listening intently to every word. This was the moment where her truth, and the truths of so many others, would finally be laid bare. The first witness called was Mrs. Turner, a teacher who had often witnessed the bullying but had been too afraid to challenge Mr. Baker or the administration. She sat nervously in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap. Julia approached her, her voice calm and steady. "Mrs. Turner," Julia began, "can you please describe what you've seen during your time as a teacher at this school?" Mrs. Turner took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with a mixture of guilt and sadness. "I've seen Monica endure more than any student should have to," she said, her voice trembling. "I've seen her be targeted by students, mocked, humiliated, and even physically hurt. And I've seen the way Mr. Baker treated her, how he made her feel like she was the problem. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid of the consequences." Julia nodded. "And did you ever report any of this behavior to the administration?" Mrs. Turner looked down, shame washing over her features. "Once," she whispered. "I did report it once, but nothing was done. After that, I stayed silent. And for that, I'm so sorry." Monica's heart ached at Mrs. Turner's confession, but she also felt a surge of gratitude that the teacher had finally found the courage to speak the truth. It was a small step toward accountability, and it mattered. Next, Emily was called to the stand. Her hand shook as she took her oath, but she stood tall, her voice filled with determination. "I was one of Monica's classmates," Emily began. "I saw what happened to her. I saw Jake and Tyler bully her relentlessly. I saw how the teachers, especially Mr. Baker, humiliated her and made her feel like she didn't belong." Julia guided Emily through her testimony, and Emily's words painted a vivid picture of the torment Monica had faced. "I didn't speak up at first," Emily admitted, tears forming in her eyes. "I was scared. But I can't be silent anymore. Monica deserves justice, and so do all the students who have suffered in silence." Jake was called to the stand next, though his demeanor was far less apologetic. He tried to downplay his role in the bullying, claiming that it had all been harmless fun and that Monica was too sensitive. But Julia's cross-examination was ruthless, exposing his lies and revealing the deep-seated cruelty of his actions. By the time he left the stand, his arrogance had diminished, and he looked visibly shaken. The most damning testimony came from a former student named Lisa, who had graduated a year earlier. She described her own experiences with Mr. Baker, how he had used his authority to belittle and intimidate students, particularly those who didn't fit his idea of respectable behavior. "He creates a culture of fear," Lisa said, her voice steady. "He picks favorites, and if you're not one of them, you're in for a rough time. Monica isn't the first, but I hope she's the last." Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a narrative of systemic failure and deliberate cruelty. Monica felt both heartbroken and validated, as though the world was finally acknowledging the depth of her pain. Her parents squeezed her hands, their eyes brimming with both pride and sorrow. Mr. Baker sat stone-faced through it all, his jaw clenched, but Monica could see the way his eyes flickered with unease. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and for the first time, it felt as though the truth was overpowering the lies. When the final witness finished speaking, the courtroom was silent, the gravity of the testimony settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Monica took a deep breath, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. The road to justice was still long, but she knew that the voices of those who had finally spoken up had changed everything. Her story was no longer just hers, it had become a catalyst for change, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom was packed with tension as the final day of the trial unfolded. Monica sat beside her parents, holding her breath as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The past weeks had been grueling, an emotional roller coaster filled with painful memories, powerful testimonies, and moments of hope. Now, everything hinged on this moment, and the weight of it all pressed down on Monica like 1,000 pounds. The judge began to speak, her voice clear and authoritative. This court has heard extensive testimony and reviewed substantial evidence regarding the treatment of Monica Williams at this school. The case presented has revealed a troubling pattern of negligence, systemic failure, and deliberate acts of cruelty. Monica's heart raced, and she gripped her mother's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The judge turned her gaze to Mr. Baker, who sat with a strained expression, the confidence he had once exuded now replaced with palpable tension. "Mr. Baker," the judge said, "it is evident that your behavior toward Monica Williams went beyond the boundaries of appropriate discipline. Your actions contributed to an environment that enabled bullying and caused psychological harm. You will be held accountable for your misconduct and will face disciplinary measures, including the suspension of your teaching license pending further investigation." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Monica's eyes filled with tears, her breath catching in her throat. For so long, she had felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare that no one would acknowledge. Now, finally, the man who had tormented her was facing real consequences. The judge continued, addressing the school administration. "As for the school, this institution has demonstrated a clear failure to protect its students and uphold its duty of care. Measures will be taken to ensure that policies are reformed and staff are properly trained to address and prevent bullying and discrimination. Additionally, financial compensation will be awarded to Monica Williams for the emotional distress and trauma she has endured." Monica's parents embraced her, tears streaming down their faces. The relief was overwhelming, like a flood washing away the pain of the past. They had fought so hard, and now, justice was being served. But the shock didn't end there. As the court proceedings concluded, a figure stepped forward from the back of the room. It was a representative from a national anti-bullying organization. "Monica," she said, her voice warm and compassionate, "your bravery has inspired so many. We would like to work with you to raise awareness and advocate for change in schools across the country. Your story deserves to be heard." Monica was stunned, her mind spinning with the enormity of it all. She had never imagined that her struggle would lead to something so impactful. The fight had been long and brutal, but it had sparked a movement that would extend far beyond the walls of her school. As they left the courthouse, Monica was greeted by a crowd of supporters holding signs of encouragement and solidarity. She felt the warmth of their presence, the strength of a community that had rallied behind her. Emily ran up to her and hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You changed everything." Monica took a deep breath, the weight of her suffering finally beginning to lift. The scars from her experience would always be there, but now they were part of a story of resilience and hope. She had fought for herself and for others, and her voice had made a difference. The ending was not just one of justice, but of a new beginning, a chance to use her pain to create something better, something that could protect those who had once felt just as lost and alone as she had. And in that moment, Monica knew that while the wounds might never fully heal, she had found the strength to rise, to speak, and to be heard. The battle had been hard won, but it had left her with a purpose and a legacy that no one could ever take away.